Next, to talk to us about environmental approvals and protection, we have Dr. Garry Middle. Dr. Middle has a lot of credentials, so I'm going to try to do my best to summarize it. Welcome, Dr. Middle.
Okay. Hi, everyone. After lunch session, it's a shocker, isn't it? Sugar levels, coffee. Okay, look, I want to talk about the current landscape in environmental approvals, environmental protection. And part of the reason why I want to do that is to encourage you as people who live next door to the environmental approvals process to actually do some training in that, okay? And so the idea being, yes, you know, you do your stuff, you're a geologist or whatever, you're a hydrologist, you do your stuff, you contribute to what goes on, but maybe you should actually understand the whole process as well and feel comfortable that what you're doing kind of fits in with that. So what I'm going to talk about, so I run a small business, mostly training in environment protection, and I'm also an associate professor at Curtin University. I'm an environmental planner, and I've worked for the EPA, I've been on the Planning Commission, I was former Appeals Convener for the Minister for the Environment, so I've been working in this space for about 40 odd years, so that's why I do the training. So why should you consider doing training? As I said, most of you live next door to this stuff. Okay? And your colleagues do all this stuff and they ask you for information, and it'd be nice to know where it all kind of fits in as well for that. Because you do contribute to the process as all those environmental approvals that go on. So it'd be good to know what it is. But also some of your activities will actually require environmental approvals. And so the stuff that you do on the ground, somebody in your organisation is going to have to get that approval for you. So it'd be useful to understand all of that. For example, seismic surveys, and they seem pretty harmless, but this kind of stuff has significant environmental impacts on marine species, in particular fish. It interferes with their communication, which means their breeding goes down, and those that do collective kind of hunting, they can't communicate very well with each other, and therefore they don't do as much hunting as they might normally do it. It interferes with their navigation because there's all that background noise that goes on. Okay, they just simply can't break through that, understand what's going on there. And there are documented cases of mass stranding of things like squids on beaches because they got completely lost and ended up in the wrong place. It can cause physical damage to the sensory system and therefore permanent hearing loss, therefore permanent communication loss occurs as well. They lose their balance. There are records of fish behind these seismic surveys that are going around in circles on their side because they totally lost their balance because of that noise that occurs for that. They're unable to communicate if they lose their hearing. For smaller things, it actually affects their hormones. That occurs as well, and so it causes stress and anxiety in fish as well, and it can induce fear and protective mechanisms that go on with that as well. And for the small animals, it either destroys organs or the whole of the organism itself, and you get all sorts of mutations because of those noise impacts. Point I'm making here is that even if you're doing exploration work, some of the activities you do can have significant environmental impact and therefore require some sort of assessment and approval for that to occur. So overall, what we see is increased mortality because of seismic surveys. And that isn't just because of marine activities, but the stuff you do on land as well. So you need to know that. So exploration, the stuff that you do. Okay, as you go out there in the bush for all your mining tenements, God knows how many there are out there. There's a lot out there, as you probably saw in the previous presenter. And so you clear your tracks and you clear around your drilling holes and that kind of thing. Well, you can't just do that. You have to get approval to do that. And you can't just do it where you want. You might like to. There are constraints on what you may or may not be able to do for that. And there's the stuff you have to do afterwards as well. So clearing, since 2005, clearing now requires a permit. Prior to 2005, that was not the case. There's a classic example, the so-called Biodiversity case, which was an example of a developer on the Nullarbor Peninsula near Denmark. He was trying to get approval for subdivision for his land. And he went to the Planning Commission, And the Planning Commission said, look, it's well vegetated and there's actually no demand for this kind of a thing to occur. You don't have infrastructure in place. We're going to knock you back. So what does he do? He goes out and, legally, he clears a road and a corridor for his power line to bring power and water into the site. EPA heard about this and looked at the Act to see whether or not this was legal. The only thing they could find was that, in fact, it's pollution because of visual amenity, visual pollution. So they took him to court and they lost. And so what it turns out was, previous to 2005, you could do whatever you wanted with respect to native vegetation clearing. That has now changed. And so there are procedures in place for that. And of course, some of your activity will associate with Aboriginal sites, and I think you've had a presentation on that already. And so, but there is a link between environmental approvals and Aboriginal heritage, which I'll explain to you in a tick for that. And then there's the old Stygo fauna, or the subterranean fauna that occurs. Okay, 46% of Australia has not been surveyed. So whenever you drill a hole and you find some Stygo fauna, it's highly likely that species has never been found before. The Uliri uranium mine, when they did their surveys, and they found 3 species of subterranean fauna which had found nowhere else except on their site. It's not surprising, therefore, the EPA said refused the Uliri mine based on that, because there's a risk of extinction of those species. Now, the minister disagreed and approved it. Nonetheless, the EPA found it to be environmentally unacceptable. So when you go out in these places where all your tenements are and no one's been out there before, you're going to find stuff which hasn't been found before. So, very quick overview, because you should all know this anyway. But from a WA point of view, it's the Environmental Protection Act, and it's Part 4, which is where EPA does its assessments. Part 5, Division 2, which is clearing of native vegetation. Division 3, Part 5 is works approval and licensing. And of course, it's the Commonwealth as well. So that's just the environmental approvals. And so for a lot of you, you may end up having to get 2 approvals for your activities in the mine that you end up working for. So what we do in the course is we'll go through those processes so you have a good understanding of what they are. And it helps you understand where you fit within that broad framework and the work that you do in that regard. So what I want to talk about in the remaining time I've got is what's happening out there in the environmental approvals landscape. I'm not going to talk about the processes. I'm talking what are the changes happening out there? What are the challenges that we're going to see? Well, first of all, there's going to be changes to offsetting. The salmon industry in Tasmania, that seemed, if you remember, just before the election, Albo introduced changes to the EPBC Act. That has huge implications for you and the mining industry as well. So I want to talk about that. Some recent changes to impact assessment in the WA process that you may have missed. There's the nature repair market, which some of the bigger companies will be interested in. The Commonwealth EPA, what's likely to happen there. And some things to watch out for in the future for that. So offsets. If you recall, offsets are these indirect compensatory measures that you have to do if you have a significant impact, which can't be avoided. For example, if you're clearing Banksia woodlands on the Swan Coastal Plain, you're likely to have to do an offset, which is either find Banksia woodlands somewhere else or do restoration works for that. So, and under the EPBC Act, there's been changes in the way offsets are now done. It used to be they wanted pristine like for like, which means if you're going to clear 5 hectares of Banksia woodland, they want you to set aside 20 hectares of pristine Banksia woodland. That used to be the way the Commonwealth wanted to do things. That has now changed. And what they're now saying is we will favour restoration over acquisition. So you need to find sites like this one here, which can be restored rather than finding pristine sites. That's been a significant change to occur. And mostly, obviously, will impact those people who work in the Swan Coastal Plain and in the agricultural areas. That's where it mostly impacts. So no more pristine for pristine. But they still like the like for like for them. Now, the EPA has introduced a different offsets policy, which mining industry is really interested in. It's an opt-in policy, but at this stage it's advice only, and the government has yet to endorse this, but the EPA is pushing it really hard. It doesn't replace the existing policy. EPA rightly has concerns about the existing policy delivering locally biodiversity outcomes, but at a regional level, it's a shocker. If you think about it, I mean, I've worked with the development industry. So you might have 5 developers, each of whom are going to clear, let's say, 5 hectares of actual woodland. And so what they do is those 25 hectares of actual woodland going to be lost. Each of those are going to have to find an offset. So maybe it's double that. So 25 hectares lost, 50 hectares. So they're going to be 5 lots of 10 hectares spread out all over the place. Well, that's not a good outcome because they all have edge effects and fire. Wouldn't it be better if they all got together and had one offset of 100 hectares? This is what the EPA is saying. They want to see regionally beneficial outcomes and not locally beneficial one. There's some guiding principles for you, which is about it's now pushing restoration rather than acquisition, looking at regional scale management and rather than local management, building resilient systems, so that restoration stuff and building resilience. Also expanding scientific knowledge. So they're quite happy to look at including your offsets, doing research on specific things. For example, if your offset is to do with a rare bat species, they would like you to do some research in a bat species as well. So they're looking at that kind of thing as well. This is an important change. Like for like or similar is now where the EPA is going. It used to be like for like only. What that means is that we're seeing a real shift in where offsets are going, and this is going to be continuing. If you think about it, if you're on the Swan Coastal Plain and you have to find an offset for 10 hectares of actual woodland, like for like, it's going to be pretty close to where you are. It's going to be very, very expensive to buy that, say, 20 hectares of land. So it might cost you, say, $500,000 to actually buy that. You could do a lot more with $500,000 in the wheat belt. It's not like for like, it might even be like for similar. But if you're away from the metropolitan area, you can get a better outcome. So we push the boundaries a bit for like. So like for similar instead. For that, looking at connectedness, so joining existing nature reserves. I'll give you an example in a minute. And looking at co-benefits for social surroundings. What does that mean? Really is that working with local conservation groups or traditional owners and get them to do the work for you. They also make recommendations for government. So some priorities about making land available and securing those. Looking at regional planning. We're pretty sure that DMIRS is doing some work on regional planning for vegetation in the wheat belt, which would be a really good outcome if they do that, and looking at recovery plans there, and therefore offsetting happening in the wheat belt. Monitoring and transparency. At the moment, all we've got is a database. No one's actually monitoring what's happening to what are offsets. Holistic values mapping. Don't know what that means, but EPA thinks they do. We'll leave that one. Research programs. So that the EPA or the government identifies research programs already so that proponents can contribute to. And looking at advanced offsets. So getting ahead of the game, thinking about your 10-year program and looking at what's going to go on and then thinking about what offsets am I going to need in the future? I'm currently working with Rottnest Island Authority on their offset strategy. We're looking at a 25-year program. They've got $400 million to spend on improving tourism on Rottnest Island. So we're looking at a strategic offsetting strategy because we know they're going to have to do some clearing for that. So get ahead of the game. And looking at who does what in delivering these outcomes. What's the role of government? So here's the first example. And so what we have is, this is the mine here, okay? And their tenement includes this bit of land here. This is a proposed extension to a national park. That's an existing national park. And what they've done is they've given up this tenement here, and they're not going to use it. They've given it up, and they're going to lock it away, and they do some rehab work here as well. So connecting this to that. So the connectedness. And working, there's a mob of TOs out there. They're working with those to actually do the rehab work, restoration work in there as well. So it's an advanced offset, and it's a strategic regional one. Rather than doing offsets around their mine, they're doing it down here. Okay, so it's like for like or like for similar in that case. So have a look at that. Okay, so what's the salmon industry got to do with you guys, the mining industry? Well, what's interesting about the EPBC Act is that there's a clause in the EPBC Act which says that if the minister makes a decision to assess or not assess, or at what level of assessment particular action to occur, at some stage he can revisit that decision and decide to do a more fuller assessment of that proposal. The salmon industry, which you probably all the news you saw about it, because there were significant concerns about what was happening in Macquarie Harbour, about the deaths and the algal blooms and what have you. Two individuals, not-for-profit groups, put in an appeal to Minister Plevisek to say, we want you to review your assessment of the expansion of salmon mining here. And she said she had to agree to it. Before she could agree to it, Albo called the election. And before he called the election, he changed the EPBC Act to now stop the ability for the minister to actually reassess a proposal in certain circumstances. I'll go through that, of course. But the long and short is, some of the approvals that have occurred through EPBC Act, which could have been revisited previously, now cannot be revisited. And that opens opportunities for people. Okay, that's basically what I just said there. So there are broader implications. Even though it's aimed at the salmon industry, it has broader implications beyond the salmon industry. Okay, so a couple of changes that you might have missed to the EP Act for EPA assessments. First of all, EPA sets environmental conditions. And as part of those environmental conditions, it often sets conditions on mining rehab and what to do and mining closure. So a new provision has come into the Act, which says that if the EPA believes that another DMA, in this case, Department of Mines, anyway, I know the environment stuff. Anyway, that department, because they've got guidelines for mining rehab and closure, the EPA will no longer set conditions for that. And therefore, there's only going to be one approval that you're going to have for your mining rehab and mine closures for that purpose. It's also to do with Part 5 clearing. If the only issue is Part 5 clearing, that's the only issue, then you won't get an EPA assessment for your proposal because it can be dealt with through Part 5. So mining closures and also Part 5 works approval. If all the impacts occur during the operation of the mine, then why do you need to have a Part 4 condition? It can be dealt with through Part 5. And so those changes have come in. The final approval for the minister, you can now, if you wanted to, split conditions or you can combine them. So, for example, if you've got 3 stages of mine and you've got a one environmental statement for all those 3 stages, but the really shocking one is stage 3, you can split it into 3 different conditions, and your first 2 stages will have very few conditions, but it's stage 3 that has all the conditions. So it enables you to split those up. Or you can combine them into one if you've got 3 different ones. And there's now a provision where environmental statements can be deleted in certain circumstances that occur. So you can get rid of all of those things. There's also increased fines for non-compliance. And so you need to be careful with non-compliance stuff that goes on. Okay, nature positive and what are the implications further? I'm not going to go through all of the kind of stuff that to do with the legislation, but I just want to talk about what we mean by actual nature positive and what are the implications for you guys. There will now be sometime this year a nature positive market, a nature repair market. Legislation was passed about 18 months ago. It's due to come in this year. And there were proposed reforms to the EPBC Act as well. And there's also stuff to do with regional planning. So doing stuff in the regions. And nature repair market is in. That stuff disappeared. But regional planning is in. For example, in Queensland, the EPBC Act, or Commonwealth is doing a regional plan on all of the renewable energy projects within Queensland. And to give industry certainty about matters of national environmental significance and what you need to do to comply with the EPBC Act. So that's going to be interesting. Unfortunately, at this stage, there's not one in WA, but I understand the EPA is working on that. So what is nature repair and what's the market all about? This idea of nature positive There's two things. First of all, we know that the biodiversity is in decline, and the idea is at some stage we're going to reach the stage where we want to stop the decline and actually start to increase the biodiversity, both in terms of cover and condition. That's the aim of what Nature Positive is. But it's about engaging with industry and business to do that. Not a regulatory thing, it's to do with working with business. So the idea is we set up a nature repair market. The government's put up nearly $8 million to help not-for-profit groups come up with restoration projects to enable those who want to do that to actually buy biodiversity credits for that. So it's funding that. You have to demonstrate biodiversity outcomes. There will be rules and methods which are yet to come into force. And what it can do is lead to tradable biodiversity credits. Now, some of you are already involved in the carbon credits market. This is the biodiversity credits market. Excuse me. For example, I've got 2 hectares of land in Ballinga. I can actually restore that and make it biodiversity, and that biodiversity I can put on the market and sell that to someone who wants to buy it. I own the property. I'm not losing the property. What I'm doing is selling that biodiversity. Then becomes tradable. So that whoever buys it can trade it on the market. If there's a lower supply and a high demand, therefore the price of that biodiversity goes up. And whoever buys the credits has to actually pay me to keep the biodiversity going on my property. So there's that part of it. So that's going to happen sometime this year. And there's a key role for traditional owners. And so it's market-based things. You can stack your credits. So at the moment with carbon credits, the best thing you can do is go monoculture, fast-growing blue gums or whatever, and that gives you rapid carbon credits. That's not going to give you biodiversity credits. If you go to the biodiversity credit market, it's a slow restoration. But what you can do is you can stack your credits. You stack your biodiversity on top of your carbon credits. So in the end, by doing biodiversity and stacking your credits, you get more credits than if you just went carbon credits. So that's the idea for that market. So keep an eye on that. And it's based on the idea about corporate philanthropic activities. So in other words, this is about companies saying we want to show green credentials. That's what it's about. So they want to go out and buy biodiversity credits. And that's how it's going to work. So it's a sellable product is what it is. We're not sure yet whether it's MNES only. So we're not absolutely certain yet. What's interesting is that the experience of overseas when this occurs is that companies won't be able to do it for less than $250 million. So unfortunately, my 2 hectares ain't going to be on the market soon. No one's going to buy it because it's not big enough. You're looking at major projects for that. And the sad thing is that the coast care groups and the land care groups, they won't be caught up in this as well because they're small beer compared to what's going to happen. So unfortunately, that's the part of that. Okay, Commonwealth EPA. It's all been talk about what it is, okay? What's going to happen. I'm going to go on the limb in here and tell you what I think is going to happen. So the original idea was that the EPA Commonwealth is going to be both the decision maker and the assessor. Now, remember, in WA, that's not the case. The EPA does the assessment and the minister does the approval. But the original proposal was the EPA to do both. It's currently the minister under the Commonwealth who does the approval and the department does the assessment part of it. So in WA, it's that. And so there was also concern by our Premier, not only about having an independent agency making a decision, not the minister, but also having dual assessment and approvals processes. So that's why the thing just fell over, based on those two things that happened. So likely changes, the most likely thing we're going to see, I mean, they have committed to it, so there will be an EPA. It's likely to be assessing only, and the minister will be a decision maker. What we're likely to see is pressure now going on to make bilateral agreements between the states and the Commonwealth much more flexible and much more easy to do. They're really, really hard to do at the moment. And the WA one's lapsed and because of changes to legislation that occurred. So we're likely to see that improved. There's going to be a push for standards for matters of national environmental significance. I have some concerns about this and what it actually means. If you put standards in legislation, there's two problems with that. One is you'll never get agreement as to what to put into legislation. Therefore, what goes in legislation is going to be really wussy. It's not going to be what people want. It's going to be so general. It's going to be like EPA objectives. I mean, if you've seen those, they're really wussy. And so that's what we could have for that. Isn't it better to actually have the agency to develop policies which are the standards? And so I think that's what's going to happen is we won't see M&ES standards in the legislation. There'll be policy by the new EPA. Not all state approvals processes are up to scratch. That's a real concern for the Senate. Now, WA is the exception. We have a pretty much world best practice. I go to international conferences of impact assessment stuff, and every time I go to one, we always get asked how good our system is, and so we have close to world's best practice. So we're okay here. We're probably going to be okay to have a single assessment process occur. Other states, not so much. You know, when you have in Queensland, the Department of Mines doing EIA, I mean, you've really got to question how independent and how good that's going to be. I know you guys are miners, but anyway. So I don't think the Commonwealth Minister is going to give up his ability to make a decision. I mean, why would you? You're the minister, okay? So he will keep. It's a he. We'll keep that. The Senate's going to be where it's going to be tough because if we want to get these things through, there's going to be a discussion about the climate trigger. Now, I don't think you need a climate trigger, and I haven't got time here to explain the reasons why, because I think you can do it existing. The whole Woodside issue can be dealt with through matters of national environmental significance, and you can deal with Scope 3 emissions through that. That's another story. I'm happy to have a debate with someone about that. There's certainly a lack of trust about the states and their ability to look after national environmental significance. Okay, things to watch. So this is the things that are going to happen, I think. First one is Scope 3 emissions. This stuff is not going to go away. And the whole stuff which is happening with Woodside is just the start of what we're going to see. It's all going to happen in the courts, so keep an eye on the courts. The Queensland Warratime mine is the classic example. The Land Court there determined that the mining lease and the approvals were not valid and therefore refused. And it was based on human rights. And it was to do with the uncertain but likely impacts of that mine on a nature reserve refuge. And climate change impacts, including Scope 3, were the reasons why they arrived at it. That's why this court outcome is really important. And there were human rights impacts that they found as well. Now, they have a Human Rights Act. Okay, I get that. But there's something we have here which is just as good, potentially. So they saw right to life, cultural rights of First Nations people, rights of children, it's important, rights of property, rights of privacy and home, and the right to enjoy human rights equality. And the interesting one is the rights of children. This is the thing to watch in the future. This is the intergenerational equity, which is in the EP Act and also in the EPBC Act. And there it is there. The present generation should ensure that the health, diversity and productivity of the environment is maintained or enhanced for the benefit of future generations. If you think about that in an objective manner, Scope 3 emissions beyond net zero at 2050, if we blow that 2-degree rise, okay, that therefore means we are not giving our children an environment which is as good as or less than what it is, better than what it is now. So that is intergenerational equity, and that's what the courts are going to decide. That is what's going to happen with Woodside. The rock art stuff is going to happen, yes, but also Scope 3 emissions will be determined in the court. And be interesting to see where the court lands, because that's a principle of the Act. Okay, it's not just a clause in the Act, it's a principle in the Act as well. Native vegetation clearing, thing to watch out for if you're a bit nervous about what your clearing's done. DWER are trialling AI to actually look at what's happening with clearing of vegetation out there. And they're hoping to be able to pick up people who are non-compliant with things as well. Heritage. This is the thing to watch for. This is, again, not going to go away, but it's going to change. Now, this is a diagram which shows the difference between Aboriginal. I know that that is wrong. Doesn't matter. It's the 72 Act, 2 Act we're worried about. The Heritage Act deals with direct impacts. The EP Act deals with indirect impacts. That's why rock art is an issue for the EPA, because it's air emissions which could impact on the patina of those rocks, and therefore the rock art will start to disappear. It's an EPA issue that they deal with. So it's actually fundamental to the EP Act, those indirect impacts. But it goes beyond that. Because if you look at the Burrup Peninsula, the Aboriginal people are raising issues beyond what the two acts could actually deal with. So there's the rock art. So what we have, they have a difference of view. Okay, so both the acts, they can deal with direct impacts. So with the rock art, you need approval to remove a rock art. Okay, and with the indirect impacts, there's going to be the environmental quality criteria for air quality, and therefore how much impact will be allowed on that rock art. So we can set criteria, but what Aboriginal people are saying is, hang on a minute, yeah, you might be okay to remove one of those rock arts, or 10 or 20. It might be okay to have some impact on the patina of these rock arts, but what we look at is the whole landscape. It's a cultural landscape. If you take one thing away, it affects the whole cultural landscape. None of that legislation deals with that. I'll give you another example. I did some work on an appeal on a rubbish tip site up in York, okay? And it was adjacent to a watercourse, and there was a birthing site on that watercourse. Can't tell you where it is, but it's on that watercourse somewhere. The elders, the women who looked after that birthing site, they did not get involved in the EPA process because they thought the EPA was going to say no to it. When the EPA said yes, they appealed, and I dealt with their appeals, and their argument is quite simple. It's this. A, would you put a rubbish tip site next to a church or a cemetery? Probably not. And the reason why would we do that? Because it kind of doesn't fit into the cultural landscape of what those things are. They're saying the same thing. You're putting a rubbish tip site next to a birthing site, which has, our value, our cultural values, goes beyond the site itself. It's the whole landscape. Don't do it. Okay? That isn't covered by any legislation, and we're going to play this out in the courts over the next 5 to 10 years. So keep an eye on that and to see where that actually goes. Offsets, I'm getting close to the end, guys. Offsets, the policy's been in place for 15 years. EPA has concerns, as I've raised before. It's basically ineffective in actually reversing a loss of vegetation. So over the last 3 years, there's been a loss of over 5,000 hectares of land because of offsetting. Okay? So the offsets have actually caused a loss of over 5,000 hectares of land. And so it's ineffective in protecting native vegetation. And there's a general mood that these things should be improved as well. Okay. So that's things to look out for. Final word, I run 2 courses. And so I run a course for Datamine, 2-day course, and an environmental essentials. And if you think you need a bit of an update on these things, last time we did this thing was at uni. You did some unit, I think called EIA. Was it called EIA in 4th year? I can't remember. If you want an update, we can give it to you on a 2-day course. Or if you want a 1-day course, I can give that to you as well for your mob. And